I have up here in my team.
Are you in trouble already?
He's already in trouble. Look at that.
Mark's in trouble. Maybe Joe can scribe.
Right. Yep. Well, usually Joe's in Linux, so I worry about him now. Then.
He's usually here by now.
Yeah, he's very reliable that way.
All right. Given how packed it is, we should start.
Yeah.
All right, let's get started. Our third illustrious co-chair will return momentarily. This is the dispatch working group, which will be followed immediately by the art area general meeting in the same room. If that is not your final destination, please off-board now. The blue sheets are circulating. Where are they now? Hold them up. Something. Martin has one behind Martin. I don't know where the other one went. Thank you in the corner. Please make sure you sign those. We have a minute taker. That's John. We don't have a Jabber scribe yet. Can we get a volunteer for a Jabber scribe? Preferably someone who's near-ish to a mic. Failing that, anyone? I could pick someone. Hey, Joe. Can you Jabber scribe? Thank you.
Okay.
Good enough.
That's what we need. Thanks.
As Barry likes to say, please note the note well. These are your rights and obligations for intellectual property, related to intellectual property, for participating in the IETF. As I like to say, you have the right to remain silent. Anything you can say can be used by the IETF. Please consult with your attorneys if you need to before participating. There has been one agenda bash on the dispatch agenda. The opportunistic encryption related to email will be moved to the art area agenda. So still in this time slot, just a little bit later on down for organizational reasons. Proposed deadlines for IETF 102. Those of you familiar with dispatch know that we operate on sort of a schedule for getting work in before the next meetings. These are the proposed deadlines. We will confirm that they are exactly what we want them to be, and then post to the mailing list when they're official. Generally, if you're not familiar with how we work, if you make the deadlines, you'll go to the front of the list for assigning agenda time. If you miss those deadlines, you're relegated to AOB and probably won't get agenda time, especially given how packed we are this time. And please name your drafts according to our usual IETF naming procedure so that we see them in our summaries. Remember also, please, that ART is the mailing list for general area topics, and the dispatch list is for stuff that this working group is actually supposed to process. And first up, Andy Newton for JSON content rules. One sec while I change JSON. You can just tell me next slide whenever you're ready.
All right.
Oh, yes.
My name's Andy Newton. I'm going to introduce a draft on JSON content rules, which is the data definition language for JSON that Pete Cordell and I have been working on for some time. Next. So what's the problem? The problem is when you have protocols or documents that have described complex JSON data structures, these days you have to kind of do it in prose, and that can get kind of lengthy and tedious. They're kind of lengthy to write and tedious to read. And then I've found that if English is not your native language, sometimes that can be a bit of a challenge. So that's one of the reasons why I think a formal definition of how complex JSON should be produced is necessary. Often we say examples are what we really need. Examples are necessary, but they're not sufficient. We have two good case studies, RDAP and JCARD. I got started in all this because of RDAP, trying to get the different RDAP implementations to be conformant with each other. And it sounded easier than it actually is. So we had a bunch of test suites originally for RDAP, but none of them actually dealt with the structure of the JSON because it was very difficult to do because there was no formal definition. So that's where this all started from. But I've also been lately dealing with a lot of JCARD issues, and the JCARD specification, just like RDAP, has a lot of examples in there. One of the problems, though, is that the examples tend to help people understand what's going on with the specification, but anytime you start stepping outside of what the examples are supposed to do, interoperability tends to suffer. Next slide, please. So when we started on this path, we started looking for, what is it we want to solve here? So one of the ideas was we want people who are writing specifications to be able to easily insert these formal definitions inside of their text blocks, inside of their prose, so they can actually more naturally describe what's going on. But we also want to be able to aid software developers when they're creating implementations, because that, at the end of the day, is the thing we're trying to get done. We're trying to make sure that protocols interoperate with each other. And as I said, we want test suites to be able to be more easily written so you can test these things out. And then the other thing is, and this is kind of something that I feel like the RelaxNG compact syntax has, it's kind of legible to the casual reader. So one of the things we're looking at is, how do you take someone who knows what JSON is, maybe hasn't actually seen JCR, but they've been around the block a couple of times. They've seen other DDLs, they've seen other schema languages, and they could probably look at it and go, yeah, I kind of get what's going on there. So next slide. So here's the history of this. We've been working on this for a couple of years. Started out with a JSON-like syntax that was not JSON compatible to define different rules. Then, taking some hints from people, some people said, hey, we want a more verbose syntax that actually has words in there. We tried that. It turns out no one really liked that. And now we settle on a syntax that's actually a proper superset of JSON. And the reason I think that's beneficial is because it allows you to take actual JSON, an example that what you're starting with, and go from there. And then you can start writing your rule sets based on that. It's an easy way to take something you already have and start crafting rule sets in an iterative fashion. We've been working on software. So one of the things we've been keen to do is, because we realize this is a complex topic, is make sure that we kind of get all the corner cases out of the way. So we actually have software. We have a piece of software that I've been working on, and plus 2 other in the works implementations, just to make sure that we understand the issues that we're dealing with. I mentioned that I got into this because of RDAP, trying to make sure there was RDAP conformance. One of the other things I wanted to do was make sure this actually worked for RDAP, because that's where this started from. And so the NICinfo RDAP client actually has JCR validation built into it now. So that's one of the things I'm working on with other RDAP implementation authors, trying to help them become more conformant with that. Next slide, please. So here's an example. This is an example of taking CIDR notation and trying to decompose it. It's just an example here, but let's say you wanted an array and you wanted to break it down into each CIDR notation into a prefix and a length. The top there in the black is what the JSON would look like, and then your first iteration of JCR could be as simple as taking that and saying, okay, the prefix is an IP address, the length is an integer. You're good to go. Of course, if you wanted to get a little more thorough about what you're trying to specify, you can say, V4 and V6 are actually different when they come to lengths. So, hey, let's break this down into 2 different types, one for V4, one for V6, where when you have a V4 address, the length is 32 versus 128 for V6. And so that's what the second example is. And you can get even more detailed if you want to. Next slide.
Oops.
So, like I said, we've done a lot of work on this. There has been discussion on the JSON working group mailing list, but the JSON working group JSON working group itself is now closed. We have at least 2 GitHub projects on this, and there have been a lot of discussions in the trackers, the issue trackers there. And then I've also had I've dealt with a lot of private email about this as well. So where we currently stand, the 09 draft is I think in really good shape. There are 2 things we would like to work on, kind of issues we'd like to close, and one's a better way of taking members in an object and how you order them. Right now, it's an inclusive OR that has an algorithm for it, but we think there's a better way of doing it, which is actually more along the lines of what people mean versus what they write. And the other is a more formal way of extending rules. You can do it now, but there's some things you have to pay attention to. So we think there's a better way of doing that. And so where we want to go now is we think it's time to actually try to get this moving along more formally in the IETF. And so we're looking for AD sponsorship via dispatch. So I think that's it. Oh yeah, and there's more. If you haven't read the draft, or it'd be great if you did. But if you go to jasoncontentrules.org, there's examples, and there's an online checker on up there as well that Pete Cordell did. So I think that's the last slide.
Okay.
So questions, comments, feedback?
Yeah, Martin Thompson. I've been aware of this for years. It's kind of interesting that you're coming now. Is this because you think it's done?
Like I said, it's very close to done. And in fact, if push came to shove, I think the 09 could go through. These other two issues, it would be great if we could get them worked out. And in fact, for the first one, we have the algorithm already. I just want to kind of get it into software before I actually formally specify it. And the second one, if we really had to, it could be an extension. So.
Yeah, so the other thing that sort of makes me a little less enthusiastic about this is just one of many. You didn't address that point in your presentation. Can you speak a little bit about the multitude of other ways of specifying JSON schemas? I mean, we already have one of them in an RFC. It's called Yang. It's not exactly the sort of thing that I think is as general purpose as what you're describing, but there's also a JSON schema. There's a bunch of other things that that exist out there. Why would we add one more to the pile? Is the question.
So I mean, we could come up with a JSON encoding rules for ASN1 too, right? Some people like abstraction layers. I'm not a big fan of them. If you want to do that, go ahead. I mean, my philosophy is just do what you want to do, but I prefer something that's a little more specific to the problem I'm trying to solve. Having to go when you're dealing with trying to get people who are writing implementations to have to learn something else that maybe not be germane to what they're working on, just in order to get software interoperability going, that's just another barrier to problems with interoperability. So something a little more targeted to JSON, I think, is what's best. Does that make sense?
The question there is, well, okay, so I have a need to consume JSON schemas for other reasons. Now I've got to deal with this other thing because the specification that I'm dealing with uses this. And there's a problem in that if we add to the pile, we now have more things that people have to manage in parallel. The reason that we have XML schemas and RelaxNG is that XML schemas were redacted. Is this better than the alternative?
Yes.
Right.
That's very subjective.
If that is entirely subjective, then,
Yes.
then we have a problem.
Well, I mean, it's always going to be subjective, right? So I am not a big fan of XML schema myself. I'd rather do RelaxNG if I had to do XML. And there are a good number of reasons for that, but there are people who are very comfortable with it. At the end of the day, I think a tool that helps you get the work done is what you want. There are always going to be people who like certain syntaxes. They want, curly braces here or something else. As long as you have a tool that helps people, I think that's what's important. Again, as far as abstraction layers go, I tend to think those get more in the way of people who are concentrating on that problem. And I've dealt a lot with people, especially, like I said, the two use cases I have are JCART and RDAP. And I've dealt with people who have to go read these things, and they're not interested in trying to figure out, especially JCART. JCART is quite complex. They have to go through 5 different RFCs to figure out what's going on, and that's very problematic for them.
So one thing I'd like to see discussed a little bit more, perhaps in the draft, is the conceptual framework that you're using for this. Now, you talked about it a little bit here. The intent is that people producing a document work directly with the JSON. You're not talking about a language that would allow you to describe mapping of the JSON into other things,
No, that's, yeah.
which is often something that people attempt to do with schema languages.
Sometimes.
And those sorts of questions would ideally be addressed, such that you can position this relative to the other things that exist in the space, and people understand whether or not this applies to them or not.
So let me get straight. You think it'd be best to formalize a way to map JSON into other,
No,
formats?
you clearly don't want that,
yeah.
right? You clearly don't want that, but I think it would be responsible of you to put that in the document.
As in if that's what you want, go use Yang or something else?
Well, you don't have to say that. You just have to say
Yes,
what
fine.
it is your intents are with respect to defining another thing.
Okay, so mark that as out of scope, clearly, is that
Right.
that's what you're saying?
Right.
Okay.
This is intended for X, and it's intended for X for the following reasons. If
That's
you want
a,
something else, then you're looking in the wrong place.
that's a great thing for me to add, yes, thanks.
Neil Jenkins. So this is purely about being able to have a common way of specifying the syntax for JSON-based protocols in the document, right? There's nowhere to put in descriptional semantics of what these properties are. So you're still going to have that separate to the structure of the object, which is...
Yeah, so we've had some proposals on how to do that, ways the JCR can be extended. And we've talked about that. To be honest, that gets into a whole nother set of problems. So I kind of want to solve this problem first, and then we can go on to how you deal with more of the semantic layer type things of a data model.
So when you...
I agree that that's a problem that may be a problem too large to swallow.
I'm just trying to make sure I understand how you envision this being used in specifications, is that you would have a description of all the properties of an object, which you need anyway to let people know what they're actually there for, and then that kind of information again, but just on the syntax level in this form of this is the exact syntax if you want to validate against something better than prose. Is that
Right,
idea?
yes, exactly. So I have a draft, I was talking about the RDAP work. There's a draft, I should have put the link in here. It's RDAP-JCR or something, which I actually took the RDAP pros, which are quite lengthy, and there's a lot of very long examples in that RFC. And I said, well, here, these are very difficult to read actually because they're so long, because they have to be inclusive of a lot of stuff. Here's the JCR for it. And the JCR is much more concise, much shorter, much easier to read. So that's probably a pretty good example to go through and say, okay, this is what the intent is. The intent is to be able to say, this is what the JSON is supposed to look like, and here's the JCR to help you with it. So.
Thank you.
Hi, Phil Humbaker. So I've done a few of these. I've got a system that allows me to, I've got my own ASN1 schema language. Well, when I was doing XML schema, I wrote my own schema language and generated the XML schema from it because XML schema was so awful. So with my JSON schema, I've produced about 8 protocols so far. And I've never once found the need to limit the range of an integer. I think that we can get rid of 90% of your spec. What I did see the other day, I was reviewing, I forget which draft it was the using TLS in applications, and they have a JSON schema where all they do is they basically take a JSON message and give all the possible values of that message in JSON as an example. And that actually provides a pretty good concrete definition of what the schema is, what tags you have and what can go in there. I'll see if I can find the link and put it in. But I don't think that we need this complexity, because unless you're doing a syntax where you're actually going to pack bytes together to get them to move them on the wire, and JSON isn't that, then JSON only has a concept of an integer. When I'm writing code, I only say whether it is int, long, or byte. I never tell the compiler that, oh, this is a number between 0 and 45. The only things I ever tell it are the minimum possible. So if I don't need that expressibility in a programming language, why would I want it in a protocol schema?
So I would disagree. I have run into cases where you did need to specify that in the protocol specification itself. The other thing is, one of the things we do a lot with JCR is we override rules locally for test suites. So you say, you can actually take the JCR, override one portion of the rule set and say, for this specific use case, this number needs to be. And the JCR allows you to do that. So that's a very good example of why you would want to do that.
I've written a heck of a lot of web services specifications in XML, and I've considered it a bug in my protocols if I've ever told somebody to use a number of items other than 0, 1, or infinity.
I would say that the majority of the use cases are that way, but there are some that require you to have limits.
Well, you say require, but I still tend to think of it as a bug.
So Eric Pasquarella, I guess I had a little more sympathy for Philip's position before I read a shit ton of Yang models, and they seem to be full of constraints about what things can contain. So, so I fear we do need that expressivity. Following upon Martin's point, this is like n plus one of these things. So we're in serious danger of XKCD 927. So the test for whether we're doing XKCD 927 is who wants to consume this. And so I guess my question is, which protocols that we're developing at IETF would wish to consume this? Because if the answer is a lot, then it's a good idea. If the answer is none, it's a terrible idea. Yeah, the answer really needs to be, I think, more closer to infinity than 0 or 1.
You can't be closer.
I'm thinking the 4-digit RFC number problem just got worse. Colin Perkins. So I have no opinion on whether this is a good idea or not. I would urge you, if we do end up doing this, to define it in a way that it's easily greppable out of the RFCs, so we can write tooling that runs with the RFCs and extracts these schemas. Oh
yeah, so the validator I wrote actually has some tooling in there to help with the RFC authorship, where you can actually you can put things in the rule set itself. So this section goes here into this file, and that way you can actually put it into an IETF document rather easily.
But some sort of prefix, so it's easy to extract it from the RFC text without having to.
Oh, from the RFC text itself. Okay, yeah, that's a good idea. So.
Does anybody have any thoughts on how this might be processed? Whether we should, what path through the IETF is appropriate here?
Well, I really was serious. I mean, who wants to use this?
Well, I want to use it.
Anybody but you.
I've had people come up over the years and say, yeah, I would like to use this before I thought it was finished.
Sure. I guess the way where I dispatch chairs, I would start by a show of hands of who in this room thinks they would use this if it was specified.
I was trying to do it free form before we went to that. But.
That's the predicate question, right? And then if the answer to that is like 0, then we just stop. And if the answer to that is like is substantially positive, then we can discuss how we got to process it.
So let me ask that question slightly different from that. So I'm interested in splitting that just a hair farther to try and figure out whether there's people who want some sort of JSON schema language other than Yang, and people who want this one a little bit. I think that's important. So can people who would use a JSON schema language other than Yang in some protocol work going on at IETF, can they, or know of work that would, can they just go to the mic and tell us which work would possibly use this? And if you have some, tell us too.
Yeah, well, like I said, the RDAP stuff, we are looking at putting routing information into RDAP, and that's going to get hairy pretty fast if I have to do it in prose. So that's one of the cases where every time I want to write an extension to this, I've got to do something, and it's becoming very difficult.
Okay.
Richard Barnes. So without any knowledge of this draft or the prior art, I'll just say that, in doing ACME, we ran into some ambiguities where this sort of thing could have been helpful. So had this been on the table while we were doing that, we would likely have done something like this to resolve some of that stuff.
Pete Resnick, if this is a completely naive question, you can send me off. Why is this different than all of the draft H. Andrews JSON schema stuff?
You talking about the actual thing called JSON schema?
Yeah.
It's a different way of doing it. It is attacking the same problem, right? I don't want to speak for them because I'm not them.
But their stuff doesn't solve your problem?
No, it does. It does it in a different way. It is essentially so the way what they're doing is they're saying, well, our DDL is going to be JSON itself. So it's, in my opinion, much more tedious to read. I've actually been through some of it. And in fact, that's where I started. And I was just like, I can't deal with this. It's much more analogous to, although I think better than what you would consider XML schema is to XML. They sent some email to the JSON working group mailing list a couple of months ago or something. And my reading of it was they weren't interested in coming to the IETF. So
They do
if
have
someone else
internet
wants to
drafts,
paraphrase
but
it, I would
yeah,
more than welcome that. That was my reading of it.
But it doesn't solve the problem that you've got as well as you would like, and therefore you've worked on this.
Yeah, and again, could be subjective. Some
No,
people.
that's fair.
Yeah.
That's what I was.
Okay, and we're going to freeze the line at Mark Nottingham, so.
So Martin Thompson again. The question of whether someone would use a schema language is definitely an interesting one. There's a number of things out here. I was hoping that Neil would get up and say that he would or would not use this for JMAP. But the thing that worries me most is that we have a number of these things, and why this particular one. One of the things that this organization has a problem with, to some extent, although less than other places I've worked, is the NIH problem. And we have to be sensitive to the fact that there may be some other solutions out there that people are using and are pretty widely used, and maybe they don't work as well as we might like, but that's okay, because that's not really something that we need to worry about. And just picking up someone else's code and using it and running it might be a better approach.
You can stay, Mark. It's okay.
Oh, he's swamped. He's
Adam Roach.
We'll let the JMAP people sneak in. It's okay.
Adam Roach as an individual. So just speaking to the question of what would end up using JSON schemas, I wanted to throw into the pile that we have a document right now going through that is basically an equivalent to the links header for CoAP. And they're using Cuddle, which is obviously designed for CBOR, but they're using it to define JSON. And I understand there's some desire to use it in that, use Cuddle for that kind of thing as well. So yeah, so there are, as far as I understand, there are basically three competing things here. There's the schema work, there's this, and then there's Cuddle. But so yes, there's definitely pressure for a schema language.
Neil Jenkins, so I'll try to be quick. Yes, so for JMAP, which is a protocol that has a lot of JSON descriptions in it, I have had a look at various schema options before. I haven't come across this one, but I've never actually found them to be that helpful in terms of our specification, in terms of increasing clarity. Most of the difficulties with the specification is making sure people understand what the properties are. We don't have complex things of this, where this must be between 0 and 45 or things like that. That generally doesn't come up. And I found that just being able to put in the type that you should expect this property along with the description in the same place is a lot easier to understand than having to have them separate with the syntax in one place and the semantics.
Well, you can kind of sort of do that with JCR via comments. Like I said, we had someone who proposed a doc annotation for being able to more kind of describe things and being able to extract it for tool sets and stuff like, kind of like RDoc or JavaDoc or something like that. Again, I mean, that's interesting, and it probably wouldn't be that type of thing as long as it didn't get too far away. It wouldn't be hard to do. I just don't think it's central to the problem at the moment. So, but I agree. That's a good next step.
Mark Nottingham. I have not read the draft. I have use cases. I think there are lots of times when we need to be able to specify JSON precisely. And we really need a better way to do that. It's not as bad as XML was, but you can specify JSON in prose, and I've done it a fair amount, but having a normal language to do that would be really useful. On the other hand, anything that people can feed into a tool, people will feed into a tool, and that's when things get really dangerous, which we kind of hopefully learned from XML and WS star and all that kind of fun in terms of extensibility, in terms of the unintended consequences of mapping data structures into other languages and so forth and so on. So that's why I think I'm twitchy about this sort of thing. We've talked about this before, and people have been twitchy about schema languages for JSON. Maybe we're talking about there's pressure to do this. Maybe it is time to take on this kind of work just so we can have one that tries to implement best practice rather than trip over the same problems again and again.
Yeah, I am fully sympathetic to what you're saying. Having witnessed people do that with XML schema where it passed the XML schema validator, and that's tricky. It's on the other hand, I've been down the other side where we in the JSON stuff where we don't have it, and people just the pros said it's an array of strings, and they had an array with a string that was comma separated with values. And I was like, what? Okay, fine. So I got where I understand how they got there, but it wasn't what we wanted. So yeah, it's a hard problem to solve.
Okay, so we want to kind of get a sense of the room. We've had people support it and other people say we don't need this. So let's go ahead and do a hum of people that think this is a good idea, and Andy and crew should keep going forward with it.
Where this is this specific version of this.
Okay, our AD is going to overtake us.
Can I ask a clarifying question? Because it was put forth, if I remember in the presentation, that this is nearly done. And so are we humming on taking this pretty much wholesale, or are we humming on starting some interest in this area?
This is taking this.
Right, that's a question I wanted to ask. Maybe there is a separate question about whether people are interested in schema of some sort.
Yeah.
Just,
That makes sense. We're thinking maybe we should do it in this order of it. If the answer to this is yes, it makes the other one irrelevant. Should we do them in the other order? We're happy to do them first. We'll do them both. Yeah. That's the important part, right? Okay.
So then the first is, do people see a need for another schema? So let's do a hum on that. If you're in support of
The ITF doing a
Right,
schema of some sort, not necessarily this
Right.
one, for JSON. So
hum now. Okay, and if you think we shouldn't be focusing on that. Okay, it's much weaker. Okay. And then we want to ask whether or not people are supportive of, this is the way forward again. It's almost done. It's been around a very long time. So let's do a hum for that. The question is, people that support this is the way forward, right? That we're not going to take the, excuse me? Oh, that's a good question. Yeah. How many people have read the draft? Oh, yeah. Okay. A half a dozen, at least, which is pretty good for our crew these days. Yes, because they've been engaged in the discussion, I guess. Yeah. Okay.
I just wanted to clarify, we already have chartered work in this space. So it's not, the
Which
question
is-
isn't, should we take on any work in this space? The question is, should we take on more work in this space? This is Joe Hildebrand, by the way.
Just a minute.
Mike.
So where is the chartered work on this space? We will promptly send
Yeah.
this there.
So in the CBOR working group, we have chartered work for CDDL.
Okay.
Well, that's
I'm
CBOR.
perfectly fine with saying we need more work in the space, or there needs to be more
Right.
JSON-specific work.
Good
but
point
it
to
is
raise.
More work.
Good point to raise, yes. We said we would do the second question about adopting this basically done piece of work or close to done piece of work as a document we move, publish as the RFC as the solution to this schema problem. So we are going to take a hum on that. Ecker, do you want to comment on
Do
this?
people
before-
want to just discuss the point Joe raised? Because I kind of did.
Sorry?
People want to discuss the point Joe just raised?
Yeah,
I kinda
okay,
did.
let's discuss it.
Yeah, I mean, if we already have chartered work in this area that we think applies to JSON specifications, like publishing this as an AD sponsored thing, and now having two things, one of which developed by a group which I think we can all agree is not like central to the use of JSON in art, is like an extraordinarily confusing situation.
Done this
So-
before.
My guess here on this is that the CUDL specification, it does cover JSON, but it's mostly for CBOR. It's for a very specific type of environment. And most of the people who spoke to, they would use this in their drafts, would probably not be willing to use CUDL in the slightest. And no, Joe's shaking his head here, thinking, so, okay. So I guess we have the question, do we want to do this and CUDL? And is CUDL the generic solution on all of those things?
Well,
And
and the only reason why I bring this up, and I don't care what the answer is particularly, the reason why I bring it up is that there have been one or two JSON specs who have used CUDL already.
right.
Yeah.
And so I'm not saying it's better or worse. I'm just saying that there is some usage of it.
And there's lots that have used JSON schema too.
Right,
Yeah,
so they're-
and I want to be clear, I have no position on the relevant technical merits of any of these specifications. I'm trying to avoid the ITF publishing in a bunch of confusing ways, a bunch of specifications which conflict for doing essentially the same task. Some was through AD sponsorship, some through working group. Like, that just seems like a really terrible, like, situation where, like, no one understands which one they're supposed to use. And, like, surely we can do better than that.
Yeah, I mean, there is a good argument for saying produce a schema language that isn't Ty21 encoding, which mine kind of is. I mean, you know, you don't need to tie the schema to one particular serialization. That said, the problem with using CUDL is the original sin of CBOR, which was they decided to create a new data model and not use the JSON data model, which some of us told them they should do, and that if they didn't, we would never use their stuff.
Okay, yeah, so we're way over time here.
So I was just
So-
going to offer one more possibility with my CBOR working group hat on for the moment. If we wanted to negotiate some mechanism where that work got pulled out of the CBOR working group, we could probably facilitate that discussion.
Okay, so I'm not sure we're going to get consensus in the room right now. I think we need to go to the mailing list. There's been good suggestions, and we'll work with our ADs to explore some of those. Thanks, folks. We were on, I think Bernie, right, has this 5 minutes?
Nope.
No, okay.
Mark, not anything.
Oh, am not, no, sorry, it's Mark is up first. Yeah, sorry, I misspoke, sorry.
We had, the old agenda was wrong, so.
Yeah, sorry about that, okay.
I have Mr. Nottingham slides.
Working on it.
Yeah,
No, I'm in the pink box, but I've got it right. Oh, never mind.
I know, I don't.
Can anyone see me? Okay.
We told them.
Shouldn't. So I asked for a little time to talk about RFC 5785 BIS. 5785 is the RFC that defines well-known URIs. Has anybody read the BIS document that I published? Hands? Oh, that's mattering. Okay. Next slide, please.
Sorry.
Thank you. So yeah, 5785 is well-known URIs, and when we put that together, it was fairly straightforward. The use cases we were thinking about was we have people doing things like robots.txt, or the W3C P3P policy for the site, or do not track was coming along even way back then. And people kept on having to do these things we call site-wide metadata, next slide, which are things about the website itself. And indeed, 5785 says that, more or less. It says it's to facilitate discovery information on a site, and it's for site-wide policy information. So it's when the site needs to speak about itself. We didn't want people stomping all over other people's websites by standardizing URI paths in the root or somewhere else, like W3C did W3C/P3P.xml. We wanted one place to do that. Next slide. And so, and that's based on, what's accepted is how we think about URIs. The Architecture of the World Wide Web, Volume 1, which was published by the W3C Technical Architecture Group, sort of like the W3C's IAB, says that the URI paths are under the control of their authority. In other words, the administrator of the origin dictates the structure of the path. And so we need to respect that. Standards shouldn't encroach into that space. If you want to understand more about why, BCP 190 talks about that. And so this was the mentality we went into well-known URIs was that they were a very limited carve-out for this purpose, for standards to define metadata for an origin so that the origin could talk about itself. Next slide. In the meantime, lots of other things have happened. Next.
I did.
Oh, you did? Yeah. Monday morning. So we've had lots of IETF protocols starting to use HTTP as a substrate. And we're currently in the HTTP working group working on BCP 56 BIS, which is how to use HTTP as a substrate successfully in IETF protocols. A common requirement of protocols using HTTP is how should I bootstrap? What URI should I use to start talking this protocol with HTTP? And unfortunately, well-known URIs seem like they're the answer to that problem. You know, you register something and you get a URI, so that seems logical to go ahead and use that. Next slide. But they weren't designed for that. We didn't envision them as a protocol bootstrap or a tunneling mechanism for new protocols on the internet. Again, you know, the whole idea was this is a very limited carve-out. And we assume that, you know, when we build protocols, we say, okay, you've got a host name, now I need a URI, so I'll use the well-known URI. And in many cases, we've found that people assume that a host name corresponds to an administrative boundary. That can be problematic. And so you're kind of buying a bit of trouble if you use a well-known URI like this. Again, BCP 56 BIS talks about why this is not a great use of HTTP. And indeed, there are very few use cases where you actually need to start with a host name rather than a full URI. In other words, when we've been talking about this with working groups that want to use well-known URIs, we've discovered many times now that just start with a URI instead of starting with a host name. Next. So the proposal in this BIS is to clarify the appropriate use section. This is a clarification. I talked to a lot of people. I don't think there are any new normative requirements in this BIS. It's just explaining what's written there in relative shorthand a little more clearly. Folks who know my writing know that I like to write really briefly, and this one was probably a little bit too brief. Talking to the ADs, we think this is really necessary because we've had a few run-ins with working groups that have tried to use well-known URIs, and we've had to walk them through what I just walked you through and say, no, this is an appropriate use, please reconsider. And that's awkward for them, and it's not pleasant for anyone, so we want to give people good advice about how to proceed using this. And so my question here, I think this is the last slide, is 5785 was AD sponsored. What's the appropriate path forward for a BIS of that document? Next slide, just in case. I think that's it. Okay, no tapping. Okay, so that's the proposal.
Have you ever seriously considered the possibility that you're wrong? No. I absolutely, and as one of the original authors of HTTP, I absolutely, completely disagree. The market has it right, you have it wrong. .well-known is a really good way of corralling web services into one place. Because what .well-known is actually is a replacement for port numbers. We've run out of port numbers, and .well-known and SRV have become the equivalent of port numbers. And that is a very well architected, very well led way of doing it to put everything in one place. And what I would like to see is web services move away from using HTTP altogether so that we only use SRV prefixes as the web service specifier. And then we can use .well-known. If the prefix and .well-known are the same, you can then say in the protocol, have one label that says, this is the web service I want to connect to. You keep saying that this is the bad way to do it, but I've yet to see you provide one good architectural reason other than there is some language back when we didn't understand what URIs were, saying this is a bad idea.
So we don't have consensus to use well-known in that fashion. I think we'd need to build consensus to use
I think
in that
there is
fashion.
consensus because people are doing it. And the only reason they can't do it is because you are the person who's the expert, and you squash all people trying to do it the way they want to do it.
PHB, I'm very willing to enter into a dialogue with you. I'm not willing to have you scream at me.
I'm inserting myself in the queue after Ted. I'll explain why at that point.
Hi, Ben Schwartz. From the DOE working group, we've definitely had a lot of discussion. I'm sure we're relatively high on the list of working groups that Mark is talking about. And I would say that we are likely to have more discussion on this topic at the DOE session this week. I wouldn't say that within our working group that we really have a clear consensus on how to handle what we're calling a discovery issue in our terminology. So getting from the DNS model where DNS servers are identified usually by an IP address, sometimes by a domain name, to adapt that to an HTTP model where services have a URI. So I think we don't have consensus there. I think there's definitely going to be discussion about using .well-known in this way, even in a way that certainly would conflict with 5785 BIS.
And thank you. You remind me. There's language in the current draft which says basically, don't do this for those purposes. However, there is an escape hatch where if you have an IETF working group, an internet standard, wants to do that, and they don't have any other viable way to bootstrap their protocol, with consultation with the ISG, you can go ahead and have registration. It's really to still allow that when there's no other option. We recognize sometimes that's necessary, but not allowing it to become this new forest of registrations that is growing all the time.
That's good to know.
Okay.
Sam Weiler, there's a subtle difference between no other option and no better option. And sometimes this might be the better option, even if we could, by stretching, do something else.
Right. And I think certainly that's a discussion that's interesting to have, but we haven't had it yet.
Ted Hardy, I want to comment on two things, one of which is mildly related to the point that Phil was making, and one of which is, I think, actually a dispatch question. One is we've had historically several attempts to manage registrations and use that as a gatekeeping function to how people used the specification that had been built in the IETF. This was particularly what we did over URI schemes for a very long time, where there was a whole registration process that was somewhat onerous and heavyweight. And our discovery was over time people stopped trying to go through the formal registration process and squatted.
Yeah.
The result of that was, after a bit of experience with the collisions which naturally occurred when people squat, is that we gave up on trying to use it as a gatekeeping function around purity, and instead said, hey, the most important thing we can do for interoperability is to avoid collision. And therefore, our aim switched entirely in the later versions of this registration process to focus on avoiding collision rather than maintaining a lean and mean schema, lean and mean scheme registry.
Right.
I point this out for the possible parallels which might be drawn. The other point I wanted to make here is 5785 was written before BCP 190, but BCP 190 did not exactly incorporate it.
It did.
Sorry?
It did.
Well, it mentions it, but the purpose of the carve out and the sort of the implications of it, I think, are left in 5785. I think as an item of coherence, that when you consider updating it, what you actually might want to consider is, instead of updating this, consolidating it into a BCP 190 BIS rather than an RFC 5785 BIS by itself. Because I think the point Phil is making is actually true. There is a disagreement on the usage of URIs here that's not about .well-known as a mechanism, but about the usage of URIs. And tackling that more directly may result in something that's eventually more productive, although I grant you that the conversation will be much harder in the short term. I pointed out because that would actually change, I think, what dispatch did with this, because it would actually suggest a scope change that I think would require a working group where an update to this particular section might not.
So I'm really sympathetic to what you were speaking about opening registries up. We've done that in most of the web-related registries, headers, link relations, so forth and so on, and try to keep them as open as possible. There are exceptions to that. The biggest one that comes to mind is methods and status codes. Status codes is a constrained space, so that's an obvious one. Methods, it's hard to articulate why we keep the method bar so high.
No,
But
I think you've actually done that quite well in the past, because the point that you've made in the HTTP working group when people have brought new methods in is that this is actually an interoperability problem. The more people use a new method that could be used with an old method and a new media type, for example, the less you're going to get interoperability among the servers which are placed in front of a particular set of resources and applications. So I think in that case, what you're talking about there is a different kind of constraint, and that is the constraint in the protocol mechanics for the generic server.
Right.
And I think that the question you have in front of you here is actually whether what you're dealing with here is a way of determining what protocol mechanics apply. That's the port argument that's being made, or whether what you're dealing with is in fact a bootstrapping method that starts with a well-known URI and retains the core protocol mechanics of HTTP. And that there's a real architectural difference between those two uses. And that's why I think BCP 190 bis is the right place to examine the problem.
So I disagree with that, because BCP 190 is about URIs in general, and well-known is specific to HTTP. And it really is about HTTP servers. Yes, other schemes have opted into it, but that's their decision. It's really primarily HTTP.
I think if any other URI scheme were to approach this problem and choose something else other than well-known, the questions about why they made that choice would be quite pointed indeed.
Perhaps. I think, so my assumption here after talking to folks was that we just needed to clarify whatever the RFC number is that just disappeared from the stream, 5785. If we want to decide something else, I think we really need to have a good look at it as a whole, which to me says it's a working group, and it really does need to be coordinated with the W3C at the very least, because frankly, this is their space more than it is our space. This is how the web works.
So again, I think that the point you were making earlier that other schemes have opted into well-known may be salient.
So and maybe we want to revisit that too.
As chair here, I have some comments. These are not as individual contributor. This is the weirdest draft I've ever dealt with. I feel like the blue caterpillar in Alice in Wonderland. I've received multiple comments of people who feel bullied on it and are not willing to come to the microphone or send comments to the list. For the record, in this case, I wouldn't say this is the right thing in all cases. I've told those people that they need to find someone to bring their technical arguments forward to the list in one form or another for them to be considered in the consensus. One technical argument that was, or it's not quite a technical argument, but one comment that came out of that discussion back and forth that I will raise here as a comment for the group to consider was, in trying to understand the requirements that we have in this space and the use cases that are upsetting people and are causing problem, could we look back at all of the requests for these namespaces that we've rejected and see if there's something common in them that we might be able to come up with a schema to address? So that was one of the comments came forward. Does that make sense as a comment?
The resolution in all the cases has been, you actually don't need one, you can just do with bootstrapping with URI.
That's not what they're asking for. They're asking for just bring forth what were the requests so we can look at why they thought they wanted to use them and see if there's a common question that we should perhaps address or not address. But I may not know enough to have pursued this conversation the right way, but I think that's what they were asking for.
Right. The commonality, it's like Rolly, Doe, a couple of others, and the common thread does seem to be well, we're using HTTP, we need to start with the URI. Oh, look, here's well-known URIs. And then, you know, the ADs, I usually involve the ADs when this comes up because it's with the working group, and I don't want to just do it as the expert, and we talk through it, and we come to a place where we realize, no, you don't need to start with a host name, you can start with the URI.
Right. So the next sort of comments that I gotten, one from Paul Hoffman here, who didn't know about this meeting and is unfortunately can't come here because of another meeting, but he would like to make sure we had time to discuss this and really work out what the consensus was and figure out that direction. It's a comment from him. And then Karsten Borman also thinks we need changes here and has proposed that inside the .well known, perhaps we should make a discovery space, where is a place where, I'm going to poorly describe this, I hate relaying somebody else's words, but that a website could configure into that place the information to tell you where the URL was that you went and used for the API you wanted, not the API in that space.
There's already a spec for that called HostMeta. Aaron Hammerlahav and I did that.
Which
I
one?
was on that. HostMeta. No, I wasn't on that. It was just Aaron.
Sorry, the name of it?
Host-Meta.
Host.
Yeah.
Okay, I will send that back. And that is my list of bizarre comments that I don't know what to do with.
Thanks. This is Daniel Kahn Gilmore. I just wanted to try to bring some external, non-IETF perspective onto why this is such a struggle. In the real world, no one knows what a URI is. No one. That may also be, but outside this room, no one knows what a URI is. And when so I'm thinking about this from the perspective of the usage profiles for DNS over TLS. If you're establishing a trust anchor, right? This is like you're bootstrapping from something that somebody understands. You need to give them something to hang on to that they can understand. And at the moment, I would also argue that nobody knows what a DNS name is either, but they think they know what a DNS name is better than they know what a URI is. And so the reason that we're having this struggle is because when people want to surface something to a user that a user can grab onto, what they settle on is a DNS name. And if you tell them, no, you have to settle on a URI, then the user interface for that doesn't work. Nothing shows URIs anymore. Our browsers don't even put the schema in the schema bar in some cases, right? I mean, some browsers don't even show the URI at all. They just show the title where the URI used to be, unless you go up and you manually fiddle with it. So none of that is exposed to the user. And so what we're talking about is an anchor that's needed because it needs to be exposed to the user. A URI is not a great match because we've lost that battle. So I'm just trying to bring an explanation to why people are trying to do the thing that you don't want them to do.
Sure. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
Ron Gondwana. I was introduced to .well-known with CalDAV and CardDAV, and your discovery mechanism is you have an email address and a password, and you need to find the right server. That took a while to understand how all that worked because documentation was difficult to track through. I'm now in the same situation with JMap where we have an email address, and from that email address, we have a right-hand side, which is a DNS name. And from that, we do a serve lookup, assuming that stacks support it, which half of them don't. For this DNS over HTTP, people try to solve that. That from a lot of places, you can't even do a server lookup. But from that, you get a host name and a port. You don't get a URI. If we define yet another way of doing that lookup that's different from how CalDAV and CardDAV work, then someone who's implementing protocols is going to have yet another thing they need to understand to even get to the point of doing a discovery lookup. So if we say we can't use this discovery mechanism, then we're going to start defining yet another XKCD 927 discovery mechanism. I'm not sure that's a win.
Hello. All I want to be able to do is that given a web service, for example, .com, and the web service has prefix foo, I want to be able to connect to that web service via DNS discovery with no additional information, given that the host may be running more than one web service on the other end. Now, right now, there is no record that allows me to do that. I think that that is an entirely rational requirement. The way that I solve it, and will continue to solve it in my protocols, is that if I have foo as my SRV prefix, I got to go to .wellknown.foo. That means that you don't need a plethora of registries because you only actually need one registry per protocol, per web service. You know, the SRV prefix can be the same as the well-known prefix. I think that that is an entirely reasonably well-argued architecture. Now, as to the bullying question, I really think that, Mark, you should step down as the expert. Because when I came with this proposal, I was really nice. The aggression that you may have been hearing earlier was because of the bullying I felt from you. You first of all told me that this is an absolutely crazy thing to do, that you mustn't do it this way, and that it's an antipath.
I want to say picking who the experts is not in the scope of this working group. That's definitely an AD thing, and I would encourage people to resolve that with ADs in the most professional way we can.
Let's take it offline, please.
Yep.
We have to close the mic after this, you last two guys, okay? We need to move on here.
Thank you, Jim Reed. We had a thing in the DNS a long time ago called the well-known services record type.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
Sorry, we had in the DNS a long time ago the well-known services record type, and that was deprecated about 25 years ago because it was thought to be a bad idea. So I don't really understand where Philip is coming from.
Okay, last.
This is Roy Fielding. I just want to, for the record, note that not only was Mark rational in that conversation, but the only disagreement was whether all of these ports should exist in the top of the .well-known space, or if there should be some intervening label, for example, PLH. So it would be .wellknown/PLH/ whatever you want to do. That's okay. It's reserving all infinite names of every port in the .well-known space just because you have an idea. That's not okay. And it's perfectly reasonable, given the space of the draft, for Mark to make that comment. And there's no reason. No,
Okay.
it wasn't. So you just contradict my thoughts.
Okay. So it's fairly Oh, great, go ahead.
Interrupt.
Okay. Boy, I like to hear that for a change. Okay, it sounds to me a lot like we have work to do here. I can take hums if we think that that's necessary, but I think we can save some time by saying this sounds also like something that needs a mini working group charter. Like we're heading in that direction and it's that serious and it needs that level of input. So do you want to take a hum on that, or do you just want to roll with that idea and say, let's talk charter?
I think it's pretty clear that it's probably not AG sponsored. If I value my
Certainly
life,
not that
I
AG.
don't want to AG sponsor it.
I think you're correct.
Okay, so
As the expert, I'm going to continue to apply the document as written in
Okay.
consultation with the area directors. If we want to change that, that's a conversation we should have. I would just ask that we do involve the W3C in that discussion.
Certainly. So do you want to start working on charters? Do you need help with, you want to solicit people for this?
I'm not the one who wants to change this.
Okay.
Okay, if you have,
Okay, he has a very strong point there. The rules are what they are, and he's not the guy who wants to change this. Show of hands of people who would be willing to participate in a working group to change this. Okay. Well, yes, Ted. I know that this is an interesting question, isn't it?
I mean, I don't want to predict the outcome, you know. I'm trying to be quite flexible. It's entirely possible. At the moment, it looks that there is at least disagreement about established consensus, but it's not clear where the consensus will land at the end, so.
Right. Ted Hardy, a clarifying point. Earlier, I made a proposal that said that if there needed to be a clarification here, The clarification was actually on the BCP 190 BIS side rather than on this side. And I believe that there may be an appetite to consider both. And I again agree with Mark that there are other non-IETF folks in both the W3C and WELT working group that would be very, very interested to know we were taking up that work. But I would like to suggest that if we are considering this, that we consider both on the table for now.
Yeah, I think that it needs to be both that's open to the scope of this, right? I mean, and the working group would decide what got changed. Is that, yeah, okay.
Okay, so let me suggest that people who are interested in drafting a charter for this should email art-ads@ietf.org, and then we'll assemble a mini group and we'll start from there.
Okay.
Okay. Thanks.
Okay, now Bernie has his 5 minutes.
Well,
Are we going to do
we're,
it?
you moved into our area, you're next, you're up for this.
Okay.
You want
No,
to, can you rush it down in like 10 minutes?
Yeah, sure. I can put it to whatever we need. So tell me how much time I have.
Let's say 15.
Okay. And now for something completely different. But equal consensus on it, I'm sure. So where do we start here? So we've been doing all this VoIP stuff for roughly 20 years, and we have a bunch of stuff that works. We have some problems that have accumulated over long periods of time that they're quite difficult to solve with some of the choices we've made. And we have some sets of requirements that have been floating around for a fair amount of time that we don't really know how to reasonably meet in some of our existing protocols. And I'm proposing that it would be a good idea to step back and take a blank sheet of paper, look at how would we do this if we could do it any way we wanted? Given what's changed in the network, what would we do differently? How would we try and do something? Now, when I say blank sheet of paper, I mean that from an abstract, how we think about it, what we look at point of view. Anything's up for change, nothing's sacred. I would hope, of course, that as we did that eventually we would figure out ways to go, well, oh, those parts there are good ideas, and actually we can patch them into what we have now if we don't need to change things. So there's a fair amount of what we would need to decide to change or not. I wrote a draft that has some very random ideas about various things that we could do quite differently and some of the problems that might solve. I'm going to talk about a couple of those today. But what I really want to motivate is getting some people, perhaps some new people that have had different networking technologies as well, to come in and think about what we would need to do differently to bring this all together. So one of the questions of things that we can do and can't do that have come up, right? What are the goals? What are the requirements? This is not just change it to make it architecturally pure or something like that. I don't care much about architectural purity, as people know. Some of the problems that we've had, and I'll hit these at a bunch of different levels. With things like, some of these things we can just simplify a lot and make much faster and easier to implement. Some of them we can make more flexible so they work better. Some of them we can do other things. We've never really been able to deal with ways where we had cascaded media very well. I'll talk about that in a couple slides. We have not had ways where we could deal with firewalls that had asymmetric media properties, so that we could perhaps send UDP out through a firewall, but we couldn't get UDP in through that firewall. So we needed to use TCP for incoming data or incoming media, but UDP out, or that type of thing, okay? Our end-to-end encryption story. We have in most of our deployments today, the DTLS SRTP or the SDES mechanisms are used as a sort of hop-to-hop in the sense between an endpoint and a mixing bridge or something in the cloud like that, a relay of some sort or an SBC, and then on to the far end endpoint. But the end-to-end media, PERC's trying to address that at some level, but how do we do that by default? How would we do that cleaner and better in a very generic environment? Pluggable at every level. I mean, I think we're seeing more and more properties where we have very pluggable congestion schemes, encryption schemes, rate adaptation schemes, pluggable codecs, that we could modularize this better than we had in the past. There's things like our overall model with SDP. There are some big problems that we've never solved in SDP. Things like that have become more and more relevant as we move away from hardware codecs to software codecs, where you might have a device that it could do 2 big screens, or 4 slightly medium screens, or 16 other ones, or an infinite number of other possibilities. We have no way to represent that in SDP. And SDP is a very difficult thing to upgrade. It has no option in it to say this is a mandatory to understand attribute. Like Jonathan Lennox pointed this out to me the other night. It's just, that makes it very difficult to do. So next slide. Let me talk about a couple examples here. Stun. This is an example of something that I think we could greatly simplify, assuming some of the stuff that's likely to happen going forward. So we use stun for about 3 different things. We use it to find the IP address to the outside of the NAT. We use it to do connectivity checks in ICE, and we use it to do ongoing consent of media sessions in WebRTC. And none of these properties are what it was originally designed for. Much of what's in it to actually do its things, like changing IP addresses and changing ports of where the answers and responses come from, none of that's used anymore, the bulk of it. So you can imagine, like, for the first use of this, you could define a new protocol that was, stun2 over QUIC, that basically you connect to the server, it sends you back the IP address, and that's it. There is no request. And the response is just, the address and port that you came from. I mean, that's really much easier to understand and implement and use than many other things. And the problem is, it's not like really a stun server is that hard to write. It's that when you go and talk to a developer and say, you need to implement this whole spec with all this crazy shit in it, just so you can find out your IP address, they go, you guys are batshit crazy. Why would I do that just to do that one thing? And, it's a good question. So next slide. Another thing that I think is very interesting for us to look at changing, and this goes at some level to changing RTP, is what would it take to reorganize not the semantic information we put in RTP, but more the syntax of how we arrange it and where we put it in RTP, to allow us to really work well with these ICN networks. So these ICN networks allow a client to express interest up to some sort of, up towards an SFU, but it might be intercepted along the way by an ICN-aware router of some sort at various different levels that could aggregate that and make it so that the SFU only needed to send 1 copy of the media across the WAN link, and then this branch office ICN-aware router distributed it to multiple clients. So it's a similar thing that what Multicast did, but it might be much more deployable in that you don't need, your network, the telco's network, the data center's network, the AWS network, to all support multicast in a way that works together. So this is one of the areas too where I think that if we started with a blank sheet of paper and figured out what we really wanted here, we might suddenly notice that, oh, actually, if we were willing to put a very specific header in the RTP header extension, we could put this into RTP with no changes to the existing RTP. But I think it's easier to think about it from a blank sheet of paper point of view. Next slide. Skip this one.
Skip it?
Yeah. Similarly with rearranging things, I mean, more and more we're getting to devices that can do quite fast processing on packets off cards. Into some, and sometimes it's distributed very much on the machine. In the same way that we're seeing a lot of computation moving from general purpose CPUs onto GPUs and back and forth between those two, we're also seeing computation starting to move onto processors on the actual NIC cards. We also have the type of environment where even if it is still happening on a main sort of general purpose CPU, there's very efficient ways to do it using a lot of these vector processing techniques. But we've probably arranged our packets. I mean, RTP was designed in a way it was never thinking about this type of stuff. It's probably not ideal for it. So we should explore what would we need to take to use these. Maybe the answer will be nothing. You can actually do it on the given stuff. But when we look at the type of throughputs that we're getting on these systems doing other things, this FD.io is a software-based router, purely software running on general purpose computer. And it's getting a terabit per second, okay? That's like 1 million HD video streams. And you guys can all, what your SFUs and MCUs do on the number of concurrent video streams it supports. But, I'm imagining you're several zeros off 1 million. So I think that this is the type of thing we could ask, like, why can't we have not a 2x improvement in performance, but, a 100x improvement in performance? Why are theirs so much better than ours? So That again would go to rethinking about this. Next slide. There's other things where we may have had constraints that are no longer really key anymore. How much time do I have, by the way?
3 or 4 more minutes.
Okay, perfect. So Turn's a good example of this. Turn, for a variety of reasons, we made very restrictive how you have to install permissions in a certain way so that you can get, before you can receive traffic from other people, you have to say the address you're expecting the traffic from, basically. And this was to preserve, to reduce concerns through certain enterprise firewalls so that they enable that type of thing. There are now so many different ways that you can make inbound relays and run servers inside a firewall and get data outside a firewall. I think this is really no longer a design attribute we needed to have. So if we remove that design attribute or limit it or reduce what type of things it works for, slack, just loosen it up a little bit. We can reduce the amount of call setup time it takes to bring up the call. We can work in a few more cases, and we can make a bunch of our stuff easier. And we could define a turn. Again, if we decide turn over quick, we could probably make it so that a turn implementation was as simple as, like, you connect to it, it tells you the public address you should use for it, and anytime a quick connection comes to that public address, any streams there get mirrored into some different streams coming down to you. I mean, it could be a very simple spec and a very simple implementation. So that might be another thing where we have constraints that can relax on this. Next slide. So the other thing I want to talk about, and this really speaks to replacing SDP. SDP was very much, I was going to say it was designed, who knows, maybe it was hatched, I don't know. But SDP, in the way we talk about it at IETF, is, Alice is talking to Bob and it's going through some proxies, and there's 2 state machines, 2 controllers on either end that are trying to synchronize what they're doing to their media stacks in this offer answer form, okay? And this is an awful model for what we actually deploy in the real world. Nearly every deployment, whether you're talking about large cloud conferencing services, or whether you're talking about enterprise PBXs, whether you're talking about large networks that have lots of SBCs in them, there's generally a controller for the call that's trying to do poke through this bizarre process of pretending it's doing offer answer with all the endpoints so that it can get these 3 clients, A, B, and C, so they can all talk to each other through the SFU, okay? And it has to do offer answer to them, and there's a state machine in A, a state machine in B and C, and then a controller has a state machine for A, B, and C, and it's trying to magically causes all those states to align in a way that's happy. So a better way to do this would be to just fully embrace this type of architecture and have the controller be able to understand the capabilities and properties of all these clients, and then be able to tell them just do this, okay, and bring that up. So, this is an area where I think we could have a design that fit much better with what we're actually deploying and made a lot of our existing problems go away. Also, at the same time, I think we could go through SDP, and I recently took the normative dependencies of the WebRTC document. So I took the W3C WebRTC document and all of its normative dependencies, and then recursively down its normative dependencies. But I stayed just in the stuff that was media or SDP. I carved out, crypto, security, protocols like TCP, et cetera, okay? And this is basically the massive stuff you need to understand the media stack in WebRTC. Perfect, thanks. And it's 4,800 pages, okay? And you just wonder, do we really need all of that? Is there a lot of stuff that we could just leave behind that we could simplify and have in a more generic way as we understand, how the codec ASICs change, how software video codecs have changed. A lot of the newer ones are just much easier to negotiate than some of the older ones, yet we're still using the older negotiation mechanisms to deal with them. So I think there's a lot of simplicity that could happen with some discussions in how to replace that. Next slide. Back a slide.
Back a slide.
Okay, I don't want to show that slide. Do not look in the agenda and go find that slide. So I think with that, I'm just going to stop right there. What I am interested in doing is, this is yeah, sure. Okay. I'm interested in finding if there's people who are interested in working on various parts of this project or various things, and trying to figure out a way that we would evolve this conversation a little bit, and then decide if there was some specific proposals that we wanted to bring forward to various working groups in the IETF.
Very short mic line.
Ronnie Evan. I read the document, and you started your presentation by saying you're not interested in the architecture, but basically you're talking about architecture, because the ITF, we try to do building blocks like this in other work groups like media control or whatever, to decompose and do whatever, and there was never a good view of everything. And I think it's maybe if you want to do it, and I was reading the document, and there's things like hop by hop encryption, but what are the hops really? So it's not clear. You have to have some architecture as part of the definition before you can start with solution. The other point I want to make is that it may be also a good opportunity, because today for transporting media, there are two general method to do that. One's over RTP and one over HTTP for the streaming and live streaming, basically the live streaming part. And I think it may be a good time to see if we can do some convergence in that space, because today it's a problem to service providers who provide IPTV and other services, that they have to have two different mechanisms to distribute the media itself. And I'm willing to work on that, of course.
Agree. Yeah, I've heard that from several
Quickly, please.
service
Mike's
providers.
closed after Harold, sorry, and really quickly, please.
Hi, I'm Colin Perkins. I'm sure you're surprised to find me at the microphone. Obviously, the network has changed significantly since we designed RTP and SDP and all the rest of this. The network we have today isn't the network we had in the mid-1990s. We have added a bunch of things to try and correct for and address some of those changes. Some things we cannot change. Obviously, any protocol that is 25 years old has a bunch of craft in it. I think there's no surprise there. Revisiting some of these decisions may make sense. I don't know. We may just set ourselves up for the next round of things which will accumulate craft for the next 25 years. One of the things
please.
One of the things we did when we were originally designing these protocols was try to make a general architecture. You're coming from a particular set of use cases, and we originally considered a much broader set of use cases. People have, to some extent we succeeded, to some extent we failed. People deployed applications using some of those other use cases and based on some of those other use cases, and some of them are very widely deployed and very widely used today. If we're going to redesign the stack, we should think about whether we want to solve this specific problem or whether it is worth trying to address the broader problem, and we should understand the scope we are addressing. A lot of the things I think you're discussing are quick issues rather than media issues. The peer-to-peer stuff is something that should be addressed quick rather than for media over quick. And I think also you are proposing unique solutions to things which I suspect the web folks have addressed, and we should perhaps consider aligning better with the web architecture for some of these issues.
I 100% agree with everything you said. Thank you.
Before Harold starts, Modern has graciously given us a few minutes of their time, so Bernie, you're still going to get your slot. Go ahead.
Iro Alistrom. When we started WebRTC, we started out trying to create the complete solution to a suite of problems. The result was that we assembled technologies, some of which had incredibly stupid decisions made for solving this set of problems. I give you Exhibit A is offer answer. Exhibit B is the two-way nature of media media sections in SDP. We do need to get away from the consequences and the costs of those stupid decisions. I do believe that we cannot do this by making an overall plan to rip out everything and replace it. So I disagree with your approach. I have disagreements with a few of your particular suggestions for technologies too, but the main thing is I disagree with your approach, because I think we need to think in terms, again, of components that can be slotted into appropriate places and interfaces that let us stop binding things together in inappropriate ways. So that when people say, our solution does not fit offer answer, well, offer answer is a tool that can be ripped out because there are well-defined interfaces between the components. I'm sorry that we lost track of that in the grand unified scheme that was WebRTC, but I think we should get back to that place.
Harold, just one question for you on that. I get how you disagree with the approach. Do you think the approach you're proposing will come out with a different result than the approach I'm doing, or do they both lead to the same point and we just get there slightly different ways?
I suspect that the overall approach will, if followed, if anyone follows, lead to something that we can deploy in 7 years from now. I suspect that the componentized approach will lead to a number of systems with differing properties, some of which are slight improvements, some of which are large improvements that will be deployed over the course of those 7 years.
Okay, after Joe, we have to wrap up here and then you can.
So this is Joe Hildebrand as Jabber Relay. This came in sort of within the latency window of you having cut the lines. So this is from John Clenson. He says, having just done a slightly similar analysis for the DNS, RFC 8324, at what point do you expect to think about what it would take to get any improvements you suggest deployed? Some of these changes imply rather significant transitions.
Where would you like to go from here?
For John, I fully understand what you're saying, and I always think about paths to deployment. This is certainly not far enough along to possibly know an answer to that yet. And I mean, Harold suggested more or less the same thing, that whatever is done on this will be totally and completely undeployable. So,
where would you like to go from here?
I would like. So my preference would be to figure out a list, it's fine with me, of dispatch, but I'd like to know a place where people who want to discuss this should continue discussing it. That I think is the only thing. And I don't even care if you don't want to discuss it. I still want to know where I can continue discussing it because you can't stop me.
I would almost suggest a new mailing list for now. Yeah.
Works for me.
Right, okay. Okay, Bernie.
Well, we got one other thing.
Okay, well, somebody else.
Adam wanted to give an update on cluster 238, if you still want to do that, otherwise Bernie's up. Yeah, thanks.
Just wanted to, you got my slide up there?
It's here, it's coming.
I just wanted to highlight for everyone that we're getting close. So cluster 238, if people aren't familiar with, is this giant wad of almost 50 documents that have a tangled web of interdependencies that have been hanging around in the RFC editor queue, waiting for everything to get back, finished up and into the queue behind it so that they can publish this entire thing, most of which is WebRTC, but there's also other media-related things in there. I wanted to highlight for everyone that we're really close to the end of this in case people are like waiting for these documents to pop out. We actually have only 11 things at the moment that are still not in the RFC editor queue. Of them, only 4, the 4 at the bottom here, are actually still in working groups. The rest have already entered the either IETF last call or IESG processing. So this should be popping out sometime really soon in case you're paying attention. Just wanted to make sure that everyone was aware of what's going on there. Thanks.
Thanks. There are 3 new bots this week. There are 7 working groups. Bernie's up. I'm trying to fly through this real fast. Yeah, 1 second. I'm bringing it over. I did. It was half a sentence. Get my pointer in the right place. Oh, you still right. There we go.
Okay. Hi everybody. I'm Bernie Hoenhuisen. I'm
about to tell you in 5 minutes what about deterministic encryption in email and messaging, what usually takes like half an hour to an hour to explain. So I give my best. Next slide. So the whole motivation comes from that the communication is always like listened into by people. We don't want to have our conversations known. So that's why we aim to make all the communication, email, chat, private by default. So as you know, we have already good tools for privacy, like PGP, OpenPGP, and others, but our users can't use them. They're just unable to use them. Like I talk about ordinary users, like your grandma, or they just can't use them. And we need to fix this usability challenge by automation. We need not just good privacy, we need easy privacy. Next slide, please. So we already built up some architecture. An architecture consists of several building blocks. You will see it on the next slide. Then the main thing is,
Sorry.
Yeah, I just
Thought you said, okay.
Yeah, I refer to the next slide. So anyway, yeah. So we'll use existing standards and RFCs whenever they are possible and they can be applied to the case. But there are still some pieces missing, and we intend to document these missing pieces in RFCs. Now, next. So this is like the whole picture of the missing pieces. So the green stuff on the left upper corner is already out. It's a whole description of the system and how it works. Then it goes further to email, like new message formats and how this process is working, like automatic generation of keys, adding the keys, and so on. We intend to add also like a mapping to S-MIME, the same to XMPP. And for that, we need kind of an easy way to establish trust. Like comparing fingerprints is not so easy. So we have a draft that is like mapping the fingerprints into trust words. We'll hear more about this tomorrow at the same time in SecDispatch. Then we have also like a trust rating system, like that the user can easily figure out whether this communication is encrypted, whether it's clear that the other guy is the one I want to talk to. And we have a mapping into user interface symbols and colors of these trust states that the user can easily understand. It's kind of this semaphore semantics. And the whole bunch, the blue area, is synchronization of keys between devices. So the users have keys on one device and receive the email on the other device and can't decrypt it. So we need to share these keys among the devices, and we need to do it securely. And from there, we can also develop some calendar and contact syncs, which is not in focus at the moment. So this is in really short how the whole architecture works. Then next slide, please. So in the IETF, we could get some help, like in MIME message formats, in public key synchronization, base protocols, mapping, URI schemes, and, for example, creating an IANA registries to support the trust establishment, and more things. Next slide. For those of you who want to know how this works, we make a small demonstration in room Waterloo on Wednesday, 10:30. So you can also ask there some more questions and discuss the things and so on. Next slide. Okay, that was it.
Okay.
So that was basically to propose or to tell you what's going on, and if there are any questions, please.
Yeah.
SecDispatch.
Okay, so this is being largely presented in more detail at SecDispatch and will be handled properly through there. We included it in art area because email is our area and we should be aware of the work that's going on. So if more questions will probably come up in SecDispatch than here. We're actually out of time. Thank you, Modern, for the extra 5 minutes, and we are adjourned. We'll see you in Montreal. Oh, blue sheets. The other blue sheet is where? We have only one up here. All right, I'll start it here again.